Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today I'm going to be doing a review and discussion of Evil Eye by Etaf. This is Etaf's second book, the first being the highly critically acclaimed A Woman Is No Man, which I have not read, but I do want to. I know that both of her books are deeply inspired by her personal experiences as a Palestinian-American woman, and I also know that this book, Evil Eye, is perhaps one of her most autobiographical pieces. And so that's why I was really excited to check this one out. And selfishly, I was also excited because this is the first time that the protagonist of a book had the same name as me. The protagonist is named Yara as well in Evil Eye, and so that kind of got me to read this one first. And I'll say that as someone who has never had that experience before, it was both really cool, but also kind of trippy to read about a character with the same name as you. I don't know how y'all do it. But anyway, that's beside the point. Like I said, this is going to be a review of the book, but it's also going to be a more general discussion of the themes and some of the critical lenses that were really brought to mind when reading this book, specifically about postcolonial feminism. And so if you're interested in that, I hope you continue watching and I hope you enjoy. So what is this story about? Evil Eye is a story about a Palestinian-American woman named Yara who believed that getting married would be her ticket to freedom away from her conservative and abusive family. And in many ways, it was. She was able to go to college, study art, and eventually get a job at a university in something that she enjoys, all the while being able to manage her home and raise two young girls. She is basically doing it all and is very grateful for the life that she has built herself and the opportunities that she has had, especially in comparison to the opportunities that her mother and her grandmother had in the past. But now, years later, a part of her is wondering, why doesn't it feel like enough? When her dream opportunity of leading a student art trip through Europe falls through, and also after she lashes out at a coworker for making a microaggressive comment, Yara is put on probation and basically forced to go to therapy if she wants to keep her job. This then forces her on a journey of reckoning with her past, with her childhood, and possibly the curse of the evil eye that her mother had always warned her about. At the same time, she is also starting to fear that she may be falling victim to the same kinds of mistakes and experiences that plagued her mother in the past. Right off the bat, I'll say this is not a book for people who like plot. Not a lot actually happens in this book to the point where it's even hard for me to describe what it's even about aside from that synopsis I gathered. This is an extremely slow and reflective book, and it's also non-linear in a lot of ways. Narratively, the story is told through present tense, interspersed with diary entries where we get to see Yara's experiences with her mother and her grandmother and her parents and what they went through in the past. But on a more emotional level, Yara's character development is also very non-linear. A lot of this book is her actively being in therapy or processing what she talked about in therapy as she kind of goes through the more mundane aspects of her life. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes on in her mind of her coming to certain realizations that maybe she is not being treated correctly or that she deserves more than what she's being given, only for her to kind of go back and convince herself that everything is fine and that she should just stick to the status quo and not give up everything that she has built. It can be a little frustrating as a reader because some of her revelations are a little obvious to us as an outside perspective. But I thought it was portrayed in a really realistic way of how someone in that situation would deal with confronting those kind of emotions and realities. There's a lot of complexity to it. It's hard to reckon with the sunken cost of a relationship that was good but not good enough, or was good and is now not good anymore, all the while trying to unpack past traumas that are still affecting you and maybe contributing to why you react in certain ways. So with all that, like I said, not a lot of plot in this book, but the real meat is within these deep reflections and watching her unpack this internal journey that she has to go on. It's the kind of book that may not resonate with everyone because there is this kind of specificity to the experience that she is going through with her Palestinian background and a lot of cultural nuances to why she may be feeling certain ways. But I also feel like even though it can be kind of specific, there is a generalizability in her experience. I feel like a lot of women particularly can relate to this. And even if you don't resonate with it, it is an important perspective, I think, for everyone to kind of see. But for me, as someone who is an Arab daughter, this book ended up hitting so hard in many specific ways. ways that triggered a lot of emotions. It felt like I was in therapy while reading this book, in both the way that it was very cathartic and allowed me to kind of process emotions that I also needed to go through, but also in the way that was uncomfortable and painful and just made me angry. I had to take some breaks while reading this book because it just triggered a lot of things. And what ended up really striking like a tender chord in me was a lot of the subtlety in this book. There are not very macro-aggressive things, there are a few, but it was the subtle ways that misogyny and gender norms are reinforced and pressured onto people, the struggles of living as a hyphenated identity in the US, and also the struggle of caring so much about how others perceive you. That latter point is exemplified by the title of the book, which is Evil Eye, and it does become a recurring theme in the story, which, if you don't know, evil eye is this kind of superstition that you can be cursed by the envy of others. And in response, there's kind of a cultural pressure to not share things about yourself, not express yourself for fear of being cursed by the evil eye, which, as you might imagine, can be detrimental for people, especially Yara in this book, as they try to process traumas that they may have gone through in the past. So this book covers a lot of topics and buzzwords, you could say, like intergenerational trauma, identity, misogyny. But what I personally found most impactful was how the book was able to portray postcolonial feminism via all these lenses. And so I want to take a moment to kind of break down postcolonial feminism, since it may be something that not a lot of people are familiar with, and it's a really important frame for not only the conversation around books like Evil Eye, but a lot of other stories by women of color. If you're from the US, you might be familiar with the first, second, and third waves of feminism. Third wave feminism being the one that arose alongside the civil rights movement and focused a lot more on intersectional issues of race and class and all those. Postcolonial feminism is similar in that sense and also arose around this same time, but it focused more on intersectionality regarding Eastern versus Western lenses. One of the pioneers of postcolonial feminist theory was Chandra Talpade Mohanty, and in her 1984 essay, Third World Women, she basically argues against a kind of universal feminism or sisterhood that ignores things like race, class, culture, and background, and all those. Especially one that positions Western feminists as the subjects of their liberation, while Third World women are in the periphery as objects of said liberation. She writes, "The Third World difference includes a paternalistic attitude towards women in the Third World. Third World women as a group or category are automatically and necessarily defined as religious, read not progressive, family-oriented, read traditional, legal minors, read they are still not conscious of their rights, illiterate, read ignorant, domestic, read backward, and sometimes revolutionary, read their country is in a state of war they must fight." It reinforces the assumption that people in the Third World just have not evolved to the extent that the West has. This mode of feminist analysis, by homogenizing and systematizing the experiences of different groups of women in these countries, erases all marginal and resistant modes of experiences. Essentially, feminism purports to stand for the equal rights and liberation of all women. However, Western feminism has co-opted what exactly liberation means without acknowledging the nuances of different cultures and what their fights might look like. Instead, it frames women in the global South as perpetual victims without agency or autonomy who need Western feminism to be saved. Importantly, Mohanty brings up that the depiction of the Third World woman is built upon the contrasting image of the Western woman as secular, liberated, and in control of all of their rights, which is hypocritical because if that were the case, then there wouldn't need to be any feminist movements in the West. The divided portrayal between East and West is an important subject brought in Edward Said's seminal work, Orientalism. Orientalism is a framework of analysis that explores how the West has essentially created and constructed an idea of the Eastern world as exotic. Think of depictions of belly dancers, or as backward and violent. Think of depictions of the veil, as well as men as barbarians. But more importantly, this constructed identity of the Eastern world was used to affirm European and Western superiority, ultimately to justify imperial interests. We saw it during the Iraq War, we saw it during Afghanistan, and we even see it to this day, this rhetoric of the West needing to enter the Middle East to liberate the oppressed women. So basically, we can see how Western feminism has not only centered itself in discussions of feminist discourse, but also has been kind of a tool of Orientalism and used to justify imperialist efforts. And in turn, we see a reactionary resistance from Native groups against Western ideas, regardless of their validity or applicability, because historically they have been wielded in a way that was harmful. And that becomes one of the central dilemmas for postcolonial feminists. How do we combat stereotypes and depictions of Middle Eastern women without minimizing real-world problems in these communities, but also not affirming Western ideas of superiority? Lila Abu-Lughod, who's a scholar of Arab ethnography and gender studies, explores this question in one of her essays, Orientalism and Middle East Feminist Studies. She writes, "Condemning feminism as an inauthentic Western import is just as inaccurate as celebrating it as a local or indigenous project. The first position assumes such a thing as cultural purity. The second underestimates the formative power of colonialism in the development of the region." She further goes on to say that feminists from the Middle East, especially those who write in English or French, are inevitably caught between the sometimes incompatible projects of representing Middle East women as complex agents, that is, not as passive victims of Islamic or traditional culture, mostly to the West, and advocating their rights at home, which usually involves a critique of local patriarchal structures. Essentially, postcolonial feminists are fighting a battle on two fronts. If they bring up issues of misogyny and women's rights in their own communities, they may be accused of betraying their community and falling victim to internalized Orientalism. But contributing to feminist discourse in the West may also be affirming stereotypes that they are so desperately trying to fight against. So that's the dilemma that I, and presumably the author etaf, as well as other people who align themselves with the ideas of postcolonial feminism, find ourselves in. Okay, so now with all that theory kind of laid out, let's go back to Evil Eye. And again, I do want to emphasize that this is a lens through which we are looking through the text. The text doesn't really explicitly mention postcolonial feminism or Orientalism or any of what I just mentioned, but it's an important underlying factor to what is the inciting event of Yara's journey, which is this microaggressive comment from her coworker. Basically, as I alluded to in the synopsis, there is this opportunity for a study abroad trip in Europe, and each of the faculty can apply to chaperone it. And so Yara and her coworkers are all trying to get this opportunity. And during one meeting, one of her coworkers basically insinuates that she's surprised that Yara will even go on this trip, or that her husband would allow her to go on this trip due to Yara's culture. And this kind of understandably sets Yara off. She calls this coworker racist and has to be either forcibly removed or removes herself from the situation to not cause further conflict. And obviously this assumption by itself is what is angering Yara, but also I think what made it sting a little more is that in her case it is partially true. Her husband is the reason why she is hesitant to even apply in the first place. Even before this comment, Yara has conversations with her coworkers asking them things like, what are they going to do about childcare if they do get into the program? And they basically kind of reply with, my husband will take care of it, or they can arrange childcare outside. It's just not really a factor in their decision, which is kind of a shock to Yara because this is not really a reality that she even considered given her relationship with her husband. Instead, actually, her husband Fadi guilts her for even wanting to go on this kind of trip. He says things like, what kind of a mother would leave her children for that long? Or what will people think if they see my wife is alone in a foreign country? And so part of the reason why her coworker's comment kind of gets under her skin in a way that things in the past have not before is because she is starting to wonder whether she is actually confirming the stereotype of the regressive Arab woman in their eyes. Which of course makes her thinking go on the defense of thinking about how there are many ways in the US that women are victims of patriarchal norms. And these are all valid thoughts, but the fact of the matter is that she is now forced to confront a dissonance that she was kind of sweeping under the rug before. In realizing that something is wrong, but not being able to vocalize it to anyone for fear of how that would reflect on her, her husband, and her community. That dissonance goes on to define the trajectory of her entire character arc throughout the book, and also closely ties into the idea of the evil eye, of what being perceived means and what kind of consequences it may have. I also don't want to make it seem that this is the only reason why Yara has trouble kind of realizing and pointing out the problems in her marriage. There's a lot of complexity around it. She has a lot of internal struggles to deal with, especially with her history of abuse, because it makes her feel like she should just accept what she has right now and be grateful for it, because it could be so much worse. But all these things kind of tie together in what makes it so hard to really sink into that dissonance and accept it for what it is. What I want to end this video on is more of the meta discussion around postcolonial feminism in the way that we view books like Evil Eye and other stories like it. While her books are generally well received, the author has received some criticisms from Arabs or Muslims, from what I could see, for portraying her community in a negative light, especially when the public perception of Arabs and Muslims is already so volatile. And I've also seen this kind of criticism levied at other authors who are talking about, I guess, more negative stories about their own cultures, or even more broadly, the issues of trauma narratives by POC that are the ones that are so popularized and widely disseminated. It's a very complicated dynamic because a lot of the times these stories are not coming from a place of abstraction. They are coming from real life scenarios, a lot of times from the author's personal experiences, like in the case of Evil Eye. And to say those stories shouldn't be told because of how they might be perceived from outside communities is, in a sense, a little reductive and also almost censoring people's experiences, which doesn't really feel right. But it is also a valid fear that in the wrong hands with someone without any level of nuance, that these narratives could be weaponized to not only propagate stereotypes, but also affirm already negative perceptions about the Arab community and further contribute to this narrative of the victimized Arab woman who needs to be saved from the oppressive Arab man. There's also the question of publishing. Why are certain stories pushed more than others? What is considered to be more palatable to a Western audience? All kinds of stories deserve to be told, but we do have to interrogate whether only certain types of stories are being told. Going back to Lila Abu-Lughod's essay, one of her central questions is asking, who are these ideas meant for? Who are we talking to? Is it to appease and be amenable to a Western lens, or is it to speak to your own community? There's not always a clear or direct answer of which one, because a lot of times these things are very enmeshed. Our biases oftentimes are implicit. But it's something that authors and readers of color have to think about, whether it's for our own personal development, in the case of individual books, or on the industry level as a whole. In the case of Evil Eye, to me, it felt like this was coming from an authentic place of wanting to share your personal experience in hopes that there will be a better future going forward. And I think part of the proof of that is that it did portray Yara's journey and struggle as one with nuance and complexity, and you got to see all the different angles that you could approach this situation. It makes not only the character, but also you as the reader sit in that dissonance so that you are forced to confront these intertangled and sometimes conflicting thoughts. Again, I don't know if this is the kind of book that will resonate with everybody, but I did think that it was very raw and honest and a good perspective that everyone should hear about. And at the very least, it is something that makes you think about your own life, your own choices, and is good fodder for discussion. With all that, thank you so much for watching this video. Please let me know if you liked this format. It's a little bit different of a format of a review, kind of a mix of review, discussion, video essay sort of thing. Please let me know your thoughts if you have read Evil Eye or Etaf's other book, A Woman Is No Man. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.